So let me just start. Okay, so to continue, yes, we are happy to invite for a keynote talk Dr. Lorella Viola. And she holds a PhD in Language and Communication Studies from University of East Anglia in UK. As for her research, she focuses on how language use reveals latent assumptions and circulates implicit ideologies in media and society. She also studies how migrants are depicted in media, and she also develops digital humanities methodologies that bridge the gap between quantitative and qualitative methods in order to unveil and understand patterns in digital archives and to encourage transparency and reproducibility in digital humanities research, as well as digital heritage practices. So without further ado, I would like to pass the microphone to our speaker. So Lorella, the floor is yours. Please start.
Thank you so much, Adam. And of course, thank you to the organizers of HistoInformatics for inviting me. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. Today I would be talking to you about the importance of being digital. This is how I decided to title my contribution to the workshop today. So before starting my speech, I would just like to say that so this is research that has been stemming from a few years of thinking and working in the field of digital humanities, but also digital history and digital heritage. Part of this, the work that I will be presenting today will be in a book that will be published next year. Today, really, I'm going to walk you through how the many issues of digital practices, for instance, transparency, authenticity, documentation, questions about reliability, engaging with sources through technology. So how all these issues have been applied in my own work. So I'm even going to take an ethnographic, a sort of auto-ethnographic, if you allow me the term, a self-reflexive approach to show how my practice as a critical DH scholar has evolved over the course of these digital projects I worked on. So in this talk, I will really start by focusing on the way digitization has been framed and understood, and to the wider consequence of this understanding, really of heritage, but also for memory, for knowledge as a whole. So you will hear me referring to traditional conceptualizations of analog and digital. I'm sure you've heard of that. We're probably sick of hearing it. The false belief in data. I will talk about technology neutrality and things like data exist somewhere as they are already. So I will talk about also the urgent role of us as humans, as researchers in these interactions. I will also discuss notions of authenticity and completeness, but also really how these notions have become entangled with concept of heritage and heritage values and practices. And I will also sort of try to rework these notions by taking, as an example, the Critical Heritage Collection Chronic Italy 3.0, to show in practice how all these notions have been reworked in my own digital heritage practice. Okay, so I think the best way to get started is probably this UNESCO statement of 2003, which recognized that the world's documentary heritage was increasingly produced, distributed, accessed, and maintained in digital form. And in 2003, UNESCO decided to officially proclaim digital heritage as a common heritage. About 20 years afterwards, so fast forward to today, if you will, this statement sounds really nothing special. We now have gotten used to the increasingly determining role of digital tools, technologies, and infrastructures in framing how heritage is understood and preserved and managed and maintained and shared and analyzed. But this is 2003, and the digital really has just started to become a thing in heritage. So really, this 2003 2003 statement by UNESCO is actually the most official indication of the undeniable shift towards the digital in cultural heritage. And this statement was also done in the context of knowledge conservation, protection, which within the wider framework of UNESCO, of course, is an issue of worldwide concern. So the document also interestingly distinguished between heritage created digitally, which since has been referred to as digitally born heritage, and it's heritage for which no other format than the digital object exists, and the digitized heritage, which is heritage, I'm quoting here, converted into digital form from existing analog resources. So what I want to do here is to reflect on the profound implications of this UNESCO statement, which, like I said, at first may appear rather trivial. But actually, when we look at it more deeply, we find that there are quite a few political and cultural ramifications of this statement. And this really has to do with the classic heritage paradigm that preserved means that whatever we decided to preserve, it's because it was worth preserving in the first place. So really when UNESCO said that digitizing was a preserving process, what really stemmed from that statement was that whatever was digitized, whatever had been digitized, was also worth preserving. So I think this equation, if you will, in a way triggers a rather troubling and puzzling also equation, which is, does that mean that whatever is not digitized is not worth preserving? So I think there is quite a lot to unpack here already. So I'm going to take a step back and I will talk about the defining characteristics of heritage as, like I just said, within the wider digital heritage, cultural heritage paradigm means that it is a risk of disappearance. And of course, this is also related to notions of authenticity, completeness, originality, permanent preservation. And as you all know, really all these questions have been central to really the way heritage has been understood. Of course, historically, such understanding of heritage has indeed gone hand in hand with a very specific type of discourse, the one dominated by Western perspectives. And these views have been based on ideas of grandiose sites as the only objects and sort of heritage worthy of preservation, which of course in turn perpetuated Western perspectives of what was worth keeping. However, from the 80s onwards, we have seen the influence of postmodernism and postcolonialism theories on which have challenged the way heritage was understood. And really, these theories have brought new perspectives on how we should really conceptualize material culture. So the idea key to this approach, which is particularly relevant to my talk today, is that really basically material culture does not intrinsically possess any meanings. Instead, meanings are ascribed to material culture when interpreted in the present. So Christopher Tilley, I think, put it marvelously in 1989, and he said, well, the meaning of the past does not reside in the past, but belongs in the present. So according to this perspective, the significance of material culture is not eternal and is not absolute, but actually it is continually negotiated in some sort of dialectical relationship with contemporary values and notions. So whatever the values that we bring in our contemporary world, this will inevitably influence the way we see the past. So through this lens, of course, also museums were no longer seen as neutral custodians of material culture, but as well grounded in Western ideologies of elitism, power, representing the interests of only a minority of population. So these considerations have led to the creation of new fields, such as, for instance, critical heritage studies, for which heritage is really understood in this continuous negotiation of past and present interactions, and always bearing in mind that heritage is not fixed and is not universal, but actually these values are always culturally situated and constantly co-constructed. So really, for those of you who are familiar with post-humanities perspectives and theories, you can see how these two fields in a way overlap, because many points of interest of post-humanities theories also say exactly the same, really. So the point that we should really, in a way, disrupt and deconstruct how we have thought of knowledge so far, because really everything needs to be reconfigured. So here in this talk today, I want to add this perspective to the way digital heritage is obviously practiced, but also in the way is understood in museums and galleries, for instance, but also in terms of heritage and policy management. So let's now take a step back again to the 2003 UNESCO statement. So after this big, official statement that introduced the digital within cultural heritage, institutions such as archives, libraries, museums, galleries, and so on and so forth started to digitize huge materials, huge quantities of heritage material. So the semantic motivation, as we have seen, was once again that, digitizing was a good way to preserve cultural resources. The direct consequences, however, of that particular discourse was that, as we have seen, the digitization process itself was framed as an operation that was heritagizing the content, if you allow me the term. So listen to this. 2 decades have passed, and we have had large-scale investments in digitization of cultural heritage. But today, it is estimated that in Europe, only about 20% of heritage has been digitized, whereas globally, this percentage is believed to remain at 15%. So if we link these percentages with what I have already told you about digital heritage in general, it is very clear to me that behind these percentages, it's really very hard not to see the colonial ghosts from the past. So critical heritage studies have taught us that heritage designation is not just a magnanimous act of preserving the past, but a symbol of previous societies and previous cultures. So when we decide which societies and whose cultures, political and economic interests, power relations, selection biases are really never far away. For example, when the first stages of large-scale mass digitization projects started, the prioritized material to be digitized was the mainstream culture, whereas minority voices were systematically excluded. And because of the paradigm digitizing equal preserving, any digitized content again became content intrinsically worth preserving. So what happened was that the previous decision of what was worth keeping basically perpetuated these biases further. What typically happened was that libraries needed to decide what to digitize, mostly based on cost-effective analysis. And so their choices were often skewed by economic imperatives rather than actual scholarly value. So for instance, one direct consequence of that approach was that foreign language material was almost always systematically excluded from digitization, not because it was not considered of high scholarly value, but because of the limitations of the technology at the time, for instance, optical character recognition, OCR software. And because libraries already knew that these resources, this type of material culture had a limited number of users to start with. So according to their business model, it didn't really make much sense to digitize those sort of material culture. So this has in turn had other repercussions because most of this digitized material has been in English. Then tools and software for exploring and analyzing the past has primarily been developed for the English language. So in other words, most of that 15% that I was talking about just a minute ago is really the sad reflection of this sort of legacy. And then there is another point that I want to make about the same legacy. And this is that the concept of the rather rigid rules of originality and authenticity that have revolved around material culture, museums, heritage in general. And how these sort of rules of originality and authenticity have legitimized the museums as the only accredited custodians of true knowledge. So within this paradigm, digital objects, of course, ended up disrupting these foundational values because they were seen as simply copies. So of course, although in a way unnecessary evil, if you will, of heritage, still they were given often a servant role to what was instead considered the real heritage, which remained the original. So here, what I want to do today is to challenge these traditional assumptions and argue for an urgent reconceptualization of digital heritage. And heritage needs to be understood, digital heritage needs to be understood as something that embeds the past, the present, and the future, as critical heritage studies have already taught us. Because all these worlds, if you will, really continually talk to each other during any digital task. And this will make more sense in a minute as soon as I give you a practical example of how that works when enriching a digital heritage collection. Let me just add before I go into that, the point that I want to make here is that any action in a digital setting is not contextless and therefore bears consequences. And any digital operation does not merely produce immaterial copies of the analog counterparts, as stated in the 2003 UNESCO statement, but in fact it creates new things, which in turn become organic, become alive, and therefore are themselves subject to a new renegotiation. So how does that relate to the notion of authenticity and cultural heritage? Okay. So more traditional positions have insisted in the fact that copies do not intrinsically possess any authority, whether digital or not. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the aura of an object defined by Benjamin already in 1935. However, more recent views have challenged these old assumptions and have postulated that actually an object-centered culture is no longer applicable when it comes to digital heritage. And this is because if we talk about authenticity in reference to digital objects, we are just obscuring what digital objects actually do. So the digital object is therefore understood as a very complex entity that is not just a mere extension of the analog, of the material object. Cameron, for instance, very recently in a book that was just published earlier this year, said that actually the very conceptualization of a digital object escapes the traditional Western ideas of curation practices. And actually authenticity may not even be something to aspire to. So this means that we need to abandon the conceptual attachment we still have to heritage, to digital heritage, as possessing some sort of objecthood. Because really digital objects and digital heritage needs to be conceptualized as a process rather than as a product. Because this process actually is never finished, and each curatorial intervention is the sum of all previous decisions and the future ones. because all the past decisions shape the way we curate the digital object today. And these decisions will in turn shape all the transformations that we will do in the future. Just to come back to the example that I just gave you a second ago, the decisions taken in early stages, large digitization practices about what not to digitize and what to digitize, eventually led to an English-centric perspective and predominance of what is available today, what English datasets, libraries trained specifically on English models, algorithms, which of course all reinforce Western worldviews, not just in digital practices, but actually in society at large. So in order to conceptualize the digital object, like I just said, as something that is never finished, as something that is situated and therefore always subject to renegotiation, I draw on post-humanities theories, and particularly Braidotti and Fuller, who created a framework to deconstruct and disrupt the traditional humanist forms of knowledge. So I think that a new concept is in fact needed when talking about digital heritage. And I came up with this new term, post-authentic. So what do I mean by post-authentic? So what I just said, basically, I mean that digital artifacts are unfinished processes that embed a wide net of continually negotiable relations of multiple internal and external factors. And I will show you in practice what that means. So this concept of post-authentic, I think, is best unpacked through the example of the curation, the construction, the curation of a digital heritage collection, Chronicle Italy 3.0 in particular, which is a corpus of Italian American newspapers published in the United States between 1898 and 1936. So the first thing to be said about Chronicle Italy is that, as the name suggests, the Chronicle Italy 3.0 is that it is the third version of the collection. Therefore, it already in itself is a demonstration of this continually negotiable nature and rapidly evolving structure of digital research. Let's have a look at the wider infrastructure that surrounds the creation of a digital heritage collection, and in particular, Chronicle Italy. So the first version of the collection, Chronicle Italy, was created within the transatlantic research project Oceanic Exchanges, which I'm sure some of you already know. So Oceanic Exchanges examined patterns of information flow from Europe to the Americas. And decided to look at 19th digitized century newspaper corpora. So the development of Chronicle Italy was basically the basis for analyze these sort of flows and in a way using text mining to find patterns of information flow. And we decided to look at ethnic newspapers, immigrant newspapers, because we thought that immigrants were a great example of how diasporic communities serve as nodes, and in particular served as nodes in the transatlantic exchange of information at the time. So this is why Chronicle Italy was aggregated to start with. And at the time, we did not really carry on any sort of pre-processing, enrichment stage, because we really wanted to just see what regular text mining could actually bring to the table. And this is just a few articles and output that stemmed out of the project, just to really show how really we were primarily based on, our research was primarily based on text mining. However, as we explore the collection further, we realized that limiting our analysis to text-based searches only was in fact sort of limiting and was not exploiting the full potential of the collection. So we decided to apply for further funding and to examine the collection further. And we decided to annotate the collection for entities. So the case that we made in order to get the funding was that we wanted to identify the spatial dimension of digitized historical data as a way to access the deeper and more subjective layers of information as immigrants were discussing these entities. We also decided to visually explore the collection by creating an app, which is the GeoNews Miner. Here is just a screenshot to allow users to conduct a finer-grained analysis. And if you want to have a look at this app, is open access, is freely available. So feel free to just play with it. So as a way to explore this sort of dimension. So all I'm saying here is that, as you can see, this is sort of the history, the prehistory of the collection. Again, two different projects, ocean exchanges, and the second grant that we got, in a way, gave originated the third version of the collection, which is Chronicle Italy 3.0. My point here exactly, which originated, in the context of yet another project awarded by the Center for Contemporary Digital History, which is where I work. We decided to create, to enrich Chronicle Italy with further layers of information within this other project, which is called Dexter, Deep Text Miner. You can access the repository and the code at this address if you want. But the whole point here is to say that the Dexter was created as a sort of, again, a reflexive, self-reflexive process. There was, while we were enriching the collection, we also wanted to reflect on how we were doing stuff. And really, we wanted to, in a way, sort of open the black box, if you will. So another thing that I want to say about Chronicle Italy is that, like its predecessors, Chronicle Italy 3.0 has also been machine harvested from Chronicling America. And I'm sure you all know about it, which is, this huge web-based archive of the Library of Congress in collaboration with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Digital Newspaper Program. So Chronicling America started in 2005, and the digitization program actually is never finished, is still ongoing. And it is a program that continuously adds titles and basically in itself encapsulates the concept of incompleteness that I want to convey with this, with my term post-authentic. So this is how the surrounding digital infrastructure impact the way digital cultural heritage is produced today. So the very constitutional structure of Chronicling America, with this funding that gets awarded to external institutions, reveals all these very far-reaching connections, power relations, multiple actors involved, which influence the decisions of what to digitize, what not to digitize, and of course exposes ultimately how decisions and digitization process can really, in a way, become intertwined with individual institutions and research agendas, which may or may not perpetuate biases. So again, with this short history of the Chronicle Italy ecosystem, I wanted to really convey how the incompleteness of the surrounding infrastructure in itself is a reflection of the incompleteness of the collection itself, and the other way around, because issues, titles are continuously added, and the Chronicle Italy 3.0 includes 3 further titles, for instance, and many more issues compared to the other 2 versions of the collection. So This is just to say that it's not just a, shameless self-promotion, but I actually have a point. And my point is that the formation of a digital heritage collection is never detached from the wider infrastructure, finding availability, awarded institutions, decisions of what to digitize and how and when. And these are all things that we needed to take into account and disrupt the concept of authenticity. So again, to come back to the concept of post-authentic and what I mean by it, I also mean that digital projects, projects, processes are understood as unfixed, subject to change, so as to allow multiple room for multiple versions. And these multiple versions are all equally post-authentic because they actually reflect different curators, different materials, have a rapid technological advances, but also the changing temporary frameworks and values we live in. So how does that relate to the title of this presentation, The Importance of Being Digital? So the Immigrant Press, which is obviously the main material for the collection, allow us really to devote attention to the study of migration as a process experienced by the migrants themselves. And this is rare because typically migration analysis, especially discourse-based migration studies, focus on discourse on migrants rather than discourse by migrants. But actually, because the immigrant newspapers were produced by the immigrants themselves, then the analysis of this collection can yield a very deep perspective on how displaced individuals dealt with social processes of migration, transformation, identity renegotiation, and how all these processes actually affected their inner notions of belonging. So when this, in a digital environment, this can be scaled up, obviously, and this means that the study of these migrants' narratives in a way constitutes some sort of migration mosaic. And in this sense, the importance of being digital lies in the fact that this information can be processed on a large scale and across different migrant communities. Moreover, because of what I just told you, records are continually updated, observations can be continually enriched, adjusted, contested, expanded, recalibrated, and so on and so forth. So the importance of being digital is exactly this. When we map these narratives and we continually update them, we also create a network of relations between the past migratory experiences and the way they were narrated by the migrants themselves, but also the diasporic communities of today and how we, in a way, our lenses, our contemporary lenses of looking at these migration processes. And it is only through these spatial temporal correspondences that really the past can become part of our collective memory. And the role of heritage in a nutshell is really this one, right? Is preventing us from forgetting the past. And by preventing us from forgetting the past, we also become part of our collective future. Abby Smith Ramsey said that the true value of the past is that is the raw material that we use to create the future. So understanding digital heritage as post-authentic entails that we need to give great emphasis on the processes that generate these mappings, these correspondences. So a post-authentic approach recognizes that these processes are never neutral, and because they incorporate this wider network and wider net of relations that are really totally independent sometimes from the curator's actions. But because a post-authentic approach recognizes these basically the illusion of complete objectivity, we also recognize by working in a post-authentic framework that these processes of management curation are never neutral, they're partial, they're situated. They're also, as I said earlier, are not completable and never complete. And for this, they require constant supervision and critical intervention. So this is heritage, right? So this means that this is the raw material that we have to create the future. So we really need to understand the importance of traceability, for instance, documenting what we did to the collection, how we transformed the source, in order to, in a way, acknowledge a collective responsibility that we have for future generation. The way we transform the data and the decisions that we have made and all the surrounding infrastructure that led to the creation of that particular collection needs to be documented. We need to be transparent about the raw data and the processed data, about the methodology, about the analytical process and tools that we use when enriching and when dealing with digital heritage. And this role of documentation is really an imperative, not just by researchers, but by museums, archives, libraries, cultural heritage institutions in general. It means acknowledging that the past is being written in the present, and as such is our sort of accountability card for future generation. And finally, my last point before opening the floor for discussion is this one. So this documentation of interventions at each stage has also a wider resonance, particularly in the context of sustainability in digital research and digital heritage in general. So in 2020, the United Nations published this report, which stated that half of the world's population, and we're talking about 3.7 billion people, currently does not have access to the internet. This digital inequality obviously exacerbates the already digital divide that affects people who are already the most vulnerable in society. I'm talking about migrants, refugees, internally displaced persons, persons with disability, women, indigenous people, rural populations, which are already disproportionately affected by the divide to start with. But heritage today is based on this universal vision of digital heritage as it has been dictated by UNESCO in 2003. And the ongoing digital reformation of cultural heritage and cultural heritage practices actually faces a big danger. And the danger is of being available exclusively to a half of the population, of half of humanity. But also, as we do this, to impose yet again Western perspectives on how cultural materials should be digitized. So how does this relate to the importance of being digital again and to curating digital collection in general? Again, if we wanted to come back to the example of Chronic Literary 3.0, we need to prefer methods and practices that that basically make the curatorial workflows sustainable, interoperable, and reusable. This includes the storage of the material in open access repositories, and whenever possible to use freely available software. And of course, a thorough documentation of the implemented steps and interventions and explanations of all the steps and choices that we have made, because this in turn will facilitate research accessibility, transparency, and dissemination, and the reusability also for those parts of the world that do not have the same infrastructure and the same resources that we do. So finally, I want to say that this needs to be taken into account when we look at the future of cultural heritage, which, to be honest, looks ever more digital. And digitally available repositories will become larger and larger. So just to quote Abby Smith-Ramsey once again, she said, when you control someone's understanding of the past, you control their sense of who they are and also their sense of what they can imagine becoming. So thinking about digital heritage as post-authentic also means fostering a reconceptualization, not just in terms of what we are digitizing, but more importantly, how and for whom. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice talk, Lorella. I'm sure there will be many questions from the audience. So anyone who wishes to start, please either raise hand or write on the chat, whichever way.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Oh, I see a hand raised.
Sure, I can kick us off. Just to first say, this was a fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I was nodding throughout, and as you were describing this concept, which I look forward to using my own work, so much of it I just thought could be applied to traditional archival collections too. That we see these things and you lay it out so well in the digital world, but I almost feel like when I go look at our library collections or some of our archival collections, even if there isn't a computer in the building, which of course there is, but just like at our traditional collections, all of this I think fruitfully helps us do it there. So that was more of a comment. My question is, I agree with you on unfinished processes, but having worked on projects, every once in a while we see pressure of like, let's set this at Amber. Let's finish the process. Let's call this a canonical resource. No more versions, nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And let's set it in stone, and this will be the authentic version of our project. And I just wonder, how would you respond to that impulse to sort of freeze our digital resources and ensure long-term sustainability, but try to move past what you're talking about here?
So thank you so much for bringing this up. Yeah, you're totally right. There is this impulse on archiving still, right? This impulse on of sort of freezing, just to use your own words. And I think that in a digital environment, really, we just have the illusion of being able to do that. Because even if we do that, precisely because it's digital, future people can always pick up where you're left. And I've seen this actually. I've seen this happening more and more recently. Projects that were sort of finished, the funding finished. There is some app somewhere, some software there, and then research keeps stemming from there, and there are spin-offs continuously. So perhaps just to use again the word original, I would say the initial object was there, the initial digital object, but we just can't control it. That's not how digital research works. Simply, I think it's our traditional Western-centric perspective on something that has to be complete. That sort of guides our intention of archiving and say like, okay, now I'm done. But actually, it's up to you, to say you're done, but you could continue potentially, right? You could do more versions, more enrichment, more exploration, more research. So I hope this answers your question.
It does, and I'm always trying to underscore, like, to students, how I agree that, as you laid out, objectivity is this, noble dream that we can't accomplish, and it's I think that answer you gave is a really, really powerful one. How
thank you
decide where to draw it, and I like, a Western-centric perspective.
Thank you.
There is some question or comment from Eva on the chat. Maybe Lorella, you can refer to that.
Absolutely. Okay, so shall I just read your question, Eva? Okay, so thank you, Lorella, for this great talk. You're welcome. Can you maybe explain a bit in more detail how you actually found the ethnic newspapers in Chronicling? Absolutely. Was it only material already digitized in Chronicling America? And if so, is this not also reproduction of the biases you talk about? Take what the nation remembers, assembles, digitizes. Where else would it be possible to find ethnic newspapers also in Europe? This is a fantastic question, and I'm really happy you brought this up actually. So so the material collected was all taken from Chronicling America. The most perhaps a more interesting way to answer your question is to say that, but how was the material aggregated by Chronicling America in the first place? Because Chronicling America is not just one person who crawls and digitizes and put things like there, but it is a huge project that embeds so many institutions that over the years, it's been 20 years now that is on, and many institutions obviously have digitized the new content depending on the cycle, right? So the question is the biases that obviously the person that the institutions that actually bidded for that particular grant. Let's say in Luxembourg, I bid and I say, I would like to digitize, this collection that is held in, I don't know, in this cultural center somewhere of Italian ethnic newspapers. And then I make a good case for it. And the actual Chronicling America infrastructure gives me that sort of money. But why did I bid for that particular collection, right? Was that because I have a specific research agenda? Is that because my institution encouraged me to push on Italian ethnic newspapers and not so much on other sort of ethnic newspapers? So absolutely, it was although it was collected from just one big source, so this umbrella, the Chronicling America umbrella, it is the Chronicling America umbrella in itself that is basically a container of all these biases, the way people assemble stuff, the way people collect and decide what to digitize, what not to digitize, and so on and so forth. So I think the powerful thing about, so this is the bad side of it, right? But the good side of it is that precisely because it's digital and precisely because this is never completed and nor completable, we can always update constantly our collection. And this is why the third version includes 10 titles rather than 7, more issues, and expands the date from 1920 to 1936, which of course in turn brings new perspectives, new voices, new states in America, so new migrants' perspectives. And to answer your last question, which was where else would it be possible to find ethnic newspapers also in Europe? Typically, these are stored in cultural centers, I found in my experience, because immigrants tended to cluster themselves around these sort of clubs, maybe around a hobby, or most often like after work. So it was like factory workers, they would cluster themselves around a particular club, and then they would produce some sort of pamphlets of newspapers even, or in a way some publications of some sort. And these collections already exist today. So this would be a great place to start in Europe, I think, to find repositories of immigrant publications of some sort, not necessarily newspapers.
I have a question also, because you mentioned non-Western preservation practices. Do you have any particular example, perhaps? What could it be? You mentioned continuity, right? That in Western mind, we may consider something is finished, but actually other cultures may consider, I don't know, more long-term processes and so on. Do you have anything else to add about what could be these non-Western practices of preservation beyond just only selection of the content, maybe something else?
Exactly. So that's exactly the point. So I don't know whether you were at the H2019 in Utrecht. No, you weren't. Okay. One of the keynote speakers actually gave a fantastic keynote about this and about, how, this digitizing sort of a process of heritage material has also been imposed and is imposing colonial perspectives, really. And the speaker gave a fantastic example of what constitutes heritage in Africa, which does not necessarily align with what is heritage in other parts of the world, right? So this includes, of course, I don't know, for instance, I think he gave the example, if I remember correctly, he gave the examples of name practices and the way these have been recorded in family sort of traditions and books and things like this, and how these are very powerful assertions of societies. It's not just family tradition. This actually entails very specific meanings that get sort of passed on to future generations. So how do you go about preserving that within the strict sort of framework of digital heritage as it is universalized by UNESCO. I think even if we don't come up with an answer, it is still worth asking the question, at least. And I would like more conversation about this. I think things are changing, and I see more and more scholars tackling these issues, but I would like more proactive examples of, digital practices of non-Western heritage material.
Yes, for example, in NLP, in natural language processing, there is ongoing discussion now how to do things for less studied languages, let's say languages of Indonesia or Africa. There is more and more research going on, funds, grants, and so on. But we perhaps don't have so much discussion on what about preservation of content, because we are now exporting these biases, as you said, for the future, right? Now, this bias is that we don't have enough participation of people in developing countries in internet and so on. They don't produce many digital artifacts, and we will then export it for the future generations, right? Because what we preserve is, of course, depending what we have now. So what could be then ways to mitigate it, like encourage digital participation of those countries, people in these countries? Just the same problem as probably you have with migrants, right? They were probably, in my opinion, I'm a computer scientist, but not really maybe wealthy at the beginning, at least part of the society. So they may have been not really accessing some newspapers and so on. So perhaps we don't have much materials on them, right? But this was in the past. It's hard to research migrant groups. What will be in the future? It's the same probably.
It is the same, and of course we don't know. I mean, we can't find what we don't know, as in we don't know what to look for, right? And I'll tell you what, the ethnic newspapers have long been ignored by mainstream literature on migration because have always been considered less worthy of value than mainstream media, because of course these migrants were sort of improv journalists, right? They just felt the need to have these publications, but very few of them were educated as journalists. So historically, this has been considered not really heritage, not worth studying, not worth being considered as impacting in the main mediatic discourse. And it's you would be surprised at how little literature there is out there historically that uses immigration studies, the voice of migrants themselves, using immigrant newspapers as sources. So this is also, a bias within a bias, if you will. So I think one way to perhaps mitigate the issue is to start the conversation. And we want to solve it today, we won't solve it perhaps tomorrow. But one thing that we for sure can do is to start the conversation and opening up to the way, first of all, digital practices are done in other countries. Because in India, for instance, the digital humanities discourse is rather different, and it is interested in very different questions than in Europe, for instance. And this is something that we just assume, oh, perhaps we should just bring more infrastructure over there. It's not so much a problem or an issue with the infrastructure, of course, resources and all that, but it's also like the questions that are mostly interested with. It's just a completely shift in really what they do want to research, what they are interested in. So first of all, opening the conversation, I think, is the first step to be done, and then take it from there.
That sounds very interesting. Are you aware of any work that would compare, let's say, digital history focus of academic people in, let's say, Asia or other continents and Western continent? Like what kind of projects, even on this level, if we compare, what kind of projects we have here in Europe in digital history and what is maybe focused over there?
Well, I can tell you that, very recently I was part of this Global Day of the Age, and they really tried to do that, right? They tried to have like a kaleidoscopic view on the digital humanities perspectives in the 5 continents. And it was really interesting to hear how digital humanities now is so big that really became something alive in itself, really, just to reiterate the point of my presentation, right? Once it's out there, it becomes alive and it changes. And that's how I know that in India, for instance, they are interested in completely different questions, and not so much, oh, how do we train a model in this particular language? Yes, they also do that, but they're mostly interested in understanding the biases or the power structures or their colonial past, and how heritage has been imposed on them. So this is something that I know that has been happening, and Global DH this year was organized by the German Historical Institute in Washington. So it is a start. Then large scale projects, I don't know whether anything is being done currently, which is definitely a gap, and it's worth exploring.
Come in the future, as you
Hopefully.
said, it started to being analyzed and studied.
Mhm.
Thank you. Are there any questions before we move on to coffee break? Okay, I don't see any. So thank you very much, Lorella. It was very interesting talk, and I'm sure we could discuss.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure we could discuss more, but yeah, let's just have a break now, and we come back in exactly 10 minutes to start paper session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye. See you soon.